My name is Laura Davies. I was 29 years old when my mother called me 2 weeks before Christmas and asked for what she called a tiny favor. I was at my desk when my phone rang. I saw her name and felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that comes from years of knowing what's about to be asked before the words are even said. She opened with small talk, the weather, her new curtains, how busy the holidays were getting. Then came the shift in her voice, the slight softening that always precedes a request. She and her boyfriend were taking a trip, the Bahamas, 10 days, a much-needed romantic getaway, she said. They'd been planning it for months. She was so excited. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned Murphy, their 14-year-old Labrador, and how they needed someone to watch him. Not asking if I could, just explaining that they needed someone. The difference mattered, though I didn't say so. I hesitated. I had plans. Nothing major, dinner with friends on Christmas Eve, a quiet few days to myself, but they were mine. I started to mention them, and she cut in gently. "Family helps family," she said. "It's just 10 days. He's so easy. You don't have kids or anything, so I figured you'd have the time." That last part landed the way it always did. Not accusatory, just factual. A reminder of what my life apparently lacked, and therefore what it could accommodate. I said yes. I always said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because the alternative, saying no to my mother, had never really been an option. The conversation ended with her thanking me, telling me she'd drop Murphy off on the 22nd, and hanging up before I could ask any real questions. I sat there for a while after, staring at my phone, feeling that old exhaustion settle back into my bones. My mother arrived on December 22nd at 9 in the morning. I heard her car pull up and watched from my window as she opened the back door and coaxed Murphy out. He moved slowly, hesitantly, his back legs stiff in a way that made me wince. She came up carrying a plastic grocery bag and holding a frayed leash. That was it. No crate, no bed, no list of instructions, just the bag and the leash and Murphy, who looked far older and more fragile than I remembered. I opened the door and she breezed in, already talking. The flight was at noon. Traffic was going to be terrible. She set the bag on my counter. Inside was a half-empty bag of generic dog food and a chewed-up tennis ball, and gave me a quick rundown that wasn't really a rundown at all. He eats twice a day. He's fine. He's low maintenance. I asked about medications. She waved her hand. He's old, Laura Davies. Old dogs are just slow. I asked about his vet. She said she'd text me the name later. I asked if he had any dietary restrictions or health issues I should know about. She looked at me like I was overcomplicating things. "He's a dog," she said. "He'll be fine." Murphy stood in the middle of my living room, panting slightly, his eyes darting around like he didn't understand where he was. I crouched down to pet him and he flinched before leaning into my hand. His fur was matted in places. He smelled faintly of urine. My mother checked her phone, kissed Murphy on the head, brief, performative, and headed for the door. Her boyfriend was waiting in the car, engine running. She turned back at the threshold, smiled, and said thank you again. Then she was gone. I stood there with Murphy, the door still open, cold air spilling in. The apartment felt suddenly smaller. He looked up at me, confused and tired, and I realized with a strange sinking clarity that I had no idea what I was doing, and neither did he. Within 48 hours, I understood the full scope of what my mother had left out. Murphy wasn't just old, he was sick. The first night, he paced my apartment for hours, panting and whimpering, unable to settle. When I finally got him to lie down, he had an accident on the floor within minutes. I cleaned it up without judgment. He looked mortified in a way that broke something in me. The next morning, I found him standing in the corner, trembling. I tried to leave for just 20 minutes to grab supplies, and he started crying, a low, guttural sound I didn't know dogs could make, so I stayed. I called my mother. No answer. I called again an hour later. Nothing. I sent a text asking about his medications, his vet, anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. She didn't respond until late that night. A single message. "He's fine. Stop worrying. Enjoy the holidays." I stared at that heart emoji for a long time. Christmas Eve came and I canceled dinner with my friends. I told them I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. Murphy wouldn't eat. He kept trying to stand and then collapsing. I spent 3 hours researching senior dog arthritis on my phone while he slept fitfully beside me. On Christmas morning, when he still refused food and started vomiting bile, I took him to an emergency vet. The clinic was nearly empty. The vet examined him and asked about his medication history. I said I didn't know. She looked at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. She ran tests: severe arthritis, kidney issues, anxiety disorder, 3 medications he should have been on, none of which my mother had mentioned. The bill was $240. I paid it and drove Murphy home in silence. That night, I sat on my couch with takeout I didn't eat, watching Murphy finally sleep under the sedative the vet had prescribed. My phone lit up with Instagram notifications. My mother had posted photos from the beach, her and her boyfriend, sunset, cocktails, a caption about gratitude and new beginnings. I turned my phone face down and didn't move for a long time. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. Murphy's medication schedule gave my hours structure: 8 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 8 at night. Between doses, I sat with him and thought about things I'd avoided thinking about for years. This wasn't the first time my mother had done this. Not exactly this, but versions of it. Small emergencies that became my responsibility without ever being framed as a choice. 3 years ago, she'd asked me to babysit her friend's children for a weekend. I didn't know the kids, I didn't know the friend well, but it was an emergency, she said, a family crisis. I took them for the weekend. Then the weekend became 4 days, then a week. No apology when it ended, just gratitude and an assumption that I'd understood. 2 years before that, she'd needed a place to store furniture during a move. A few weeks, she'd promised. It sat in my spare bedroom for 8 months. I worked around it. I stopped having people over because I was embarrassed by the clutter that wasn't mine. When she finally picked it up, she acted like she'd done me a favor by not leaving it longer. There were smaller things, too. Money I'd lend that was never mentioned again, errands I'd run, plans I'd canceled. Each time she'd framed it as urgent, temporary, necessary, and each time I'd absorbed the cost without naming it. I started to see the pattern, not with anger exactly, more like watching a documentary about someone else's life and slowly recognizing your own face on the screen. My mother operated from a framework I'd never questioned. My time was communal. My space was available. My energy was a shared resource she could access on demand. Her needs were always urgent. Mine were always flexible. She never asked if I was busy because the answer didn't matter. She asked for favors the way someone might ask to borrow a pen, casually, with the assumption of yes already built in. I stopped calling her. I stopped sending updates about Murphy. When my phone buzzed with messages from extended family wishing me happy holidays, I responded politely and said nothing about where I was or what I was doing. Something had shifted. Not a decision exactly, more like a curtain pulling back. Murphy started sleeping near me at night. He'd stopped flinching when I reached for him. One evening, I sat on the floor beside him, running my hand along his back, and I thought about where he'd come from. My mother had gotten him from her boyfriend. Her boyfriend had gotten him from a neighbor who couldn't keep him anymore. No one had wanted the work, so he'd been passed along until he landed with me. I looked at him and saw the cycle clearly for the first time. January 1st came and went without a word from my mother. I didn't reach out. I waited. Not in anger, not in anticipation, just waited. Murphy and I had fallen into a rhythm by then. Morning walks before the sun came up, medication with a spoonful of wet food, afternoons on the couch where he'd rest his head on my lap and sleep without twitching. He'd stopped having accidents. He ate consistently. He looked at me now with something I can only describe as trust. On January 3rd, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Hey, hun, we extended the trip a few more days. You're the best." I read it twice. No acknowledgement that January 1st had been the return date. No apology for the delay. No question about whether I could accommodate the extension. Just an update delivered with the assumption that my compliance was guaranteed. I didn't respond. It wasn't a planned silence. I simply had nothing to say. Or maybe I had too much to say and knew that none of it would land the way it needed to. So I set my phone down and went back to what I was doing. That silence felt different than any silence I'd held before. It wasn't passive. It wasn't avoidance. It was a choice, a boundary I didn't announce because I didn't owe an announcement. I realized something in the days that followed. My mother had never faced consequences because I had always absorbed them. Every inconvenience, every broken agreement, every assumption, I'd taken it on and smoothed it over so she never had to feel the weight of what she'd done. I'd been a buffer between her actions and their outcomes for so long that she'd stopped seeing me as a separate person with my own limitations. I took Murphy to a proper vet that week, not the emergency clinic, but a gentle, older doctor who specialized in senior dogs. She adjusted his medications, showed me how to manage his arthritis, and gave me a schedule I could actually follow. Murphy wagged his tail in her office. I'd never seen him do that before. Meanwhile, my mother's Instagram continued. Spa days, sunset dinners, couples massages, a photo of her laughing with a cocktail captioned, "Living my best life." I didn't feel angry looking at those photos. I felt something quieter, a kind of clarity that settled in my chest like cold water. I would not chase, I would not explain, I would not accommodate. I would simply stop performing the role she'd assigned me. 10 days after the original return date, my mother texted to say she was coming back. No apology, just logistics. She'd be at my apartment around 3. I responded with one line, "We need to talk when you get here." She sent back a thumbs up emoji. She arrived late, closer to 4, tanned and relaxed in a way that made her look younger. She came in talking immediately about the resort, the food, how amazing her boyfriend was, how she'd needed this trip more than she realized. She glanced at Murphy briefly, gave him a distracted pat on the head, and kept talking. Murphy had hobbled over to her when she walked in. He stood near her legs, waiting for something. Acknowledgement, affection, I wasn't sure. She didn't seem to notice. I interrupted. "We need to talk." She blinked, surprised. "Oh, okay, what's up?" I asked her to sit. She did, still smiling like this was going to be a pleasant conversation. I sat across from her and kept my voice level. I explained what the past 3 weeks had been, the emergency vet visit on Christmas morning, the medications she hadn't mentioned, the accidents, the anxiety, the canceled plans, the sleepless nights trying to figure out what was wrong with a dog I hadn't been told was sick. I listed it all calmly, without raising my voice, like I was reading from a report. She listened, but her expression shifted from confused to defensive before I was halfway through. "I didn't think it would be such a big deal. He's just a dog. You don't have kids, so I figured you had time." The comment landed in my chest like a stone. Not sharp, just heavy. I didn't react. I reached for the folder I'd prepared and slid it across the table. Inside were printed receipts, the emergency vet visit, the follow-up appointment, medications, supplies, all of it itemized. $863. She looked at the papers and laughed. Actually laughed. "Laura Davies, come on, you can't be serious." "I am." Her face faded. "You're really going to charge me for this? I hired you without asking. This is the bill. I expect reimbursement within 2 weeks." Her face changed. Confusion first, then irritation, then something colder. "You're really going to charge your own mother?" I met her eyes. "You hired me without asking. This is the bill." She stood up abruptly, gathering Murphy's leash and the bag I'd repacked for her. She muttered something under her breath, cold, ungrateful, something like that, and walked toward the door. Murphy followed slowly, looking back at me once before they left. I closed the door behind them and stood in the sudden quiet of my apartment. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The texts started within hours. My aunt, "Your mom is really hurt. She was just asking for help." My cousin, "I heard what happened. Family doesn't charge family, Laura Davies." Even my mother's boyfriend, someone I'd spoken to maybe twice. "She's upset. She didn't mean any harm." I read each message carefully. I could see what had happened. My mother had called them. She'd told her version, the version where she'd asked her daughter for a simple favor and been handed a bill in return, the version where I was cold and transactional and unreasonable. The emergency vet visit, the concealed medications, the extended trip, the canceled plans, none of that made it into her story. It had been erased, smoothed over, reframed into something that painted her as the wounded party. I didn't respond, not to any of them. I thought about it. I drafted messages in my head, explaining what had actually happened, laying out the timeline, the receipts, the deliberate omissions, but every version I imagined felt like begging for permission to have boundaries, like I needed their approval to protect myself. So I let the messages sit unanswered. The pressure of it was real, being villainized by people who only had half the story, knowing they were talking about me, deciding I was cruel, difficult, ungrateful. It pressed against my chest in quiet moments. But something else was happening too, something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel the compulsion to fix it. I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need their validation or their approval. For the first time, my own clarity felt like enough. I blocked my mother's number, not out of anger, not to punish her, just to create space, self-preservation, not spite. I took a week off work. I slept more than I had in months. I sat with the weight of what I'd done, not the invoice, but the boundary itself, and processed the fact that I'd likely changed my relationship with my mother permanently. There was grief in that, but there was also relief. On the 8th day, I unblocked her number to check if she'd tried to reach me. There was one voicemail. I listened to it standing in my kitchen. Her voice was irritated, impatient. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the invoice. Instead, she told me I was being dramatic, that I needed to move on, that she was planning to move some furniture next month and needed help. I deleted the voicemail and set my phone down. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter, something close to certainty. 2 months passed in relative silence. I heard nothing from my mother directly, but family has a way of filling in the gaps whether you ask them to or not. My cousin called in late March. She was chatting about something else, her job, her kids, and mentioned in passing that my mother was overwhelmed. Murphy's health had gotten worse, she wasn't keeping up with his medications, she was talking about taking him to a shelter because she couldn't handle it anymore. I listened without saying much. After we hung up, I sat with the information for a long time. This was the hardest part, not the confrontation, not the invoice or the blocked number or the family texts. This, the choice to not rescue again. Every instinct I had told me to step in, to call my mother, to offer to take Murphy back, to fix the problem because no one else would, and Murphy would suffer if I didn't. But I also knew what that would mean. It would reset everything. It would teach my mother that consequences were temporary, that my boundaries were negotiable, that if she just waited long enough, I'd absorb the cost again. So I didn't call her. Instead, I texted my cousin privately. I sent her the name and number of Murphy's vet. I included a list of low-cost senior dog care resources I'd compiled during those 3 weeks. I explained his medication schedule in detail. I made it clear, gently but clearly, that I would not be taking Murphy back, but I wanted to help in other ways if I could. She thanked me. She said she'd pass the information along. I sat with the grief of that decision. I wasn't callous. I cared about Murphy. I thought about him often, the way he'd learned to trust me, the way he'd sleep with his head on my lap. But I also understood that my mother's inability to care for him was not my emergency to solve. It never had been. The power reversal was quiet. I was no longer the default solution. My mother had to face the consequences of her own decisions without me as a buffer.
3 weeks later, my cousin texted again. My mother's boyfriend had taken Murphy. He had space, he had time. Murphy was doing better. The resolution wasn't heroic, it wasn't dramatic, it was just that my absence had forced someone else to step up, and they had. 6 months after everything started, my mother sent me a text inviting me to a family barbecue. The message was casual, breezy. It mentioned the date, the time, who would be there. It ended with, "Hope you can make it," followed by a sun emoji. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no reference to the invoice, the silence, the months that had passed, just an invitation delivered as if nothing had changed. I read it twice and didn't respond. I didn't decline, I didn't explain, I just let it sit there, unanswered, the way her texts about Murphy had sat unanswered in those final days of her trip.
The emotional cost of maintaining boundaries is that people misunderstand you. My extended family still saw me as the problem, the daughter who overreacted, who held grudges, who chose money over family. I heard it in the way conversations shifted when I was mentioned. I saw it in the careful distance certain relatives kept. I stopped trying to correct the narrative. I realized that people who benefit from your compliance will always reframe your boundaries as cruelty. It's easier for them to believe you're cold than to examine the system that required your warmth in the first place. I couldn't control how they saw me, and I'd stopped needing to. My life had changed in small, significant ways. I'd started dating someone who respected my time, who asked before assuming, who understood that care went both ways. I'd gotten a promotion at work. I'd stopped answering calls from people who only reached out when they needed something. I'd learned to protect my energy the way I'd once spent it carefully, intentionally. In July, I ran into my mother at a grocery store. She was in the produce section, picking through apples. I saw her before she saw me. For a moment, I considered turning around, avoiding the interaction entirely, but I didn't. She looked up and our eyes met. She smiled, polite, distant, the kind of smile you give someone you used to know. "Laura Davies, hi." "Hi." We stood there for a moment. She asked how I was. I said I was good. She said she was good too. The conversation was surface level, careful, like we were acquaintances navigating small talk. There was no resolution, no tearful reunion, no acknowledgement of what had fractured between us, just two people who no longer knew how to be in each other's lives. She said it was good to see me. I said the same. Then she walked away, her cart rolling quietly down the aisle. I stood there for a moment before continuing my shopping. It's been a year now since that phone call 2 weeks before Christmas. The relationship with my mother hasn't healed. I don't know if it ever will, at least not in the way I once hoped it might. But I've made peace with that. I've learned that some relationships are built on unequal terms. One person gives, the other takes, and the imbalance becomes so normalized that questioning it feels like betrayal. Walking away from that isn't abandonment, it's self-preservation. I gained things I didn't know I needed: the ability to say no without justifying it, the capacity to prioritize my own needs without apologizing for them, the understanding that love doesn't require self-erasure, that boundaries aren't cruelty, that protecting yourself isn't the same as punishing someone else. I don't frame this as a victory. There's no satisfaction in the distance between my mother and me, no triumphs in the silence, just clarity. The kind that settles in slowly, like dust after a storm, and reveals what was always underneath. I think about Murphy sometimes. I hope he's comfortable. I hope the boyfriend is kind to him. I hope his final years are gentler than the ones that came before. I think about the version of myself who answered that phone call, the one who said yes without hesitation, who absorbed the cost without question, who believed that family meant giving until there was nothing left. I feel compassion for her, but I also feel relief that I'm not her anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not even sad, not in the way I thought I'd be. I've simply found a kind of peace that only comes from choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. I'm sitting in my apartment now, the same apartment where Murphy paced anxiously that first night, the same living room where I sat on Christmas, exhausted and alone, watching him finally sleep.
But it feels different now. It feels like mine, not a space I'm borrowing, not a place where other people's emergencies land and take root, just mine. No one else's crisis, no one else's demand, no one else's assumption that I'll say yes. Just quiet, just peace, hard won and unshakable. And for the first time in years, that's enough.